The stagecoach arrived in Dust Creek, Texas, on a Thursday in the middle of August 1882, and with it came the kind of woman that small towns spend the rest of their lives arguing about. She stepped down from that rattling, sun-baked coach before the driver even had a chance to offer his hand, and she landed on the cracked red dirt of Dust Creek's main street with her chin lifted and her eyes taking in everything at once, the way a person does when they have learned that every new town could either be a refuge or another kind of trap. Her name was Julia Dugan. She was 24 years old, and she had come from Memphis, Tennessee, with a single leather trunk, a carpetbag worn thin at the handles, and a secret she was not yet ready to share with anyone. Dust Creek in the summer of 1882 was the kind of town that existed because someone had once found water nearby and then forgotten to leave. It had a general store, a livery, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though listening for gossip, a saloon called the Copper Spur that never truly closed, a sheriff's office with a broken window that had been covered with oilcloth for 6 months, and enough dust in the air on any given afternoon to sand the paint off a barn door. The population sat somewhere around 300 souls, depending on whether you counted the Mendez family who lived 6 miles out on the creek road, and most people did because old Ernesto Mendez made the only decent bread in the county. Julia stood in the middle of all of this and breathed it in and did not flinch. That alone was noticed. She just stood there, Mabel Hutchins, the postmaster's wife, would say later at every social gathering for the next 3 years. Stood right there in the dust with her back straight like she owned the street. I knew then she was either very brave or very lost. As it turned out, she was a little of both. She had written ahead to Mr. Archibald Foss, who ran the general store, inquiring about work. She had a hand for bookkeeping, she had written, and a willingness to learn whatever else was needed. Archibald Foss, whose eyesight was failing and whose patience for arithmetic had never been particularly strong, had written back in his cramped and suspicious hand that he would give her a trial period of 2 weeks, and that he paid fair wages for fair work and not a cent more. Julia had accepted without argument, which told him something about her situation that she herself had not yet said aloud. She walked to the general store with her trunk being carried by the stagecoach hand. A young boy named Pete, who was 16, and already had the squint of a much older man from staring into the western sun. She paid him from a small purse that was not empty but was not full either, and she thanked him with such genuine warmth that he blushed to the roots of his sandy hair and nearly walked backward into a horse trough. That was when Ezekiel Hale saw her for the first time. He was coming out of the livery across the street, his dark hat in his hand and his black hair damp from the pump water he had just poured over his head to cut the heat. He was 28 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who work land instead of offices, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that made up the canyon walls north of town, and eyes that were a particular shade of dark brown that could look almost black in certain light. He had a ranch about 4 miles east of Dust Creek, 200 acres of grass and limestone and stubborn cattle, a place he had built up from raw land with his own hands and the help of 2 hired men named Clem and Rodrigo, and he came into town every Thursday for supplies and to settle whatever business the week had brought him. He saw Julia Dugan pay the boy, saw her smile, saw the boy nearly fall over himself, and something in Ezekiel Hale went very quiet the way a field goes quiet before a storm rolls in. He did not approach her. He was not the kind of man who approached strange women in the street. Instead, he put his hat back on, settled it low over his eyes, and went into the general store to get his supplies. She was already at the counter, speaking to Archibald Foss, who was squinting at her with the expression of a man trying to determine whether a horse he was considering buying had a hidden limp. "You said 2 weeks' trial," Julia was saying, her voice clear and measured with just enough Tennessee in it to soften the edges. "I'll begin tomorrow if you'll show me your ledgers today." "They're a mess," Archibald said, which was the closest he ever came to an apology. "Then I'll need the rest of the afternoon," she said pleasantly, as though this were entirely reasonable because it was. Ezekiel moved to the far end of the counter and began examining the bolts and nails laid out there, and he told himself he was not listening to the conversation, and he was absolutely lying to himself. Archibald caught sight of him and straightened slightly. "Hale, your usual." "Yes, sir," Ezekiel said. "Add a 50-pound sack of oats if you've got them." "I've got them. This here is Miss Dugan. She's going to be working the accounts." Ezekiel turned and lifted his hat just enough to be polite. "Miss Dugan." Julia looked at him with those direct, assessing eyes that would become famous in Dust Creek for their ability to make people feel simultaneously seen and uncertain. "Mr. Hale," she said. That was all. He paid for his things, loaded them into his wagon, and drove back to his ranch under a sky that was turning the color of hammered copper in the west. He thought about her all the way home, which irritated him considerably because Ezekiel Hale was a practical man, and thinking about a woman you had exchanged 4 words with did not strike him as particularly practical. He told himself it was the novelty. New people did not arrive in Dust Creek often. He would get used to her presence the way you got used to any new thing, and then she would simply be part of the town's furniture, and that would be the end of it. He was, of course, entirely wrong. The first 2 weeks of Julia Dugan's employment at Foss General Store were a matter of public record in Dust Creek, in the sense that everyone watched them the way they watched the weather, for signs of what was coming. What was coming, as far as Archibald Foss was concerned, was a miracle. His accounts, which had been kept in a style best described as optimistic chaos, were transformed in 4 days into something that made actual sense. She found 3 separate instances where suppliers had been overcharging him, wrote careful letters disputing the amounts with a directness that made Archibald wince in anticipatory embarrassment, and collected on 2 of the 3 within the first week. She reorganized the dry goods shelves so that the things people needed most were easiest to reach, suggested that he consider stocking a small selection of medicinal herbs that women frequently had to order from 2 towns over, and learned the name of every regular customer within the first 5 days. People liked her. That was the simple fact of it, and simple facts in a small town are the most powerful kind. She boarded at the home of a widow named Clara Brent, who had a spare room and a strict policy about gentlemen callers that she announced to Julia on the first day the way a general announces a battle plan. Julia agreed to every condition with the same pleasant directness she brought to everything, and Clara Brent found herself unexpectedly charmed. "She's polite," Clara reported to Mabel Hutchins. "Genuinely polite, not that thin, papery kind, the kind that comes from actually thinking about other people." Ezekiel Hale came into town the following Thursday, as he always did, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that. It took 3 visits before anything more significant than a greeting was exchanged, but even those greetings began to evolve in small and interesting ways. By the second Thursday, she called him by his first name, which surprised him. By the third, he called her Julia, which surprised her, and then she smiled in a way that he had not seen before, open and warm and a little bit startled, and he felt that quietness in himself again, deeper this time. It was the sheriff's annual summer social that actually broke the careful distance they had been maintaining. Every year in late August, Sheriff Dale Prewitt hosted a gathering on the green space behind the church, which was too small and weedy to be called a park but served the same purpose. There were tables of food, a fiddle player, and enough social pressure for everyone in Dust Creek to attend whether they wanted to or not. Julia came with Clara Brent, wearing a green dress the color of new leaves that she had evidently made herself, because it fit her perfectly, and no ready-made dress in the county would have managed it. Ezekiel came because he always came and because Clem, his older hired hand, had told him he was getting strangely antisocial and needed to spend some time among human beings that were not cows. Ezekiel had told Clem that he paid him to work cattle and not to provide opinions on his social life. And Clem had said that was fine, but he was still going to the social. And Ezekiel had come along because, if he was being honest with himself, which he tried to be even when it was uncomfortable, he had wanted to come. He found Julia standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the fiddle player with the expression of a woman who was 2 seconds away from wanting to dance, but had not yet found a reason that felt safe enough. He walked over without quite deciding to walk over, which was the way the best decisions in his life had always happened, not with planning but with a kind of inevitability, as though something larger than his own preferences was gently moving him in a direction. "Do you dance, Miss Dugan?" he said. She looked at him with those eyes. "Julia," she said, because she had already corrected him twice. "Julia," he said, and the name felt different when there was no counter between them. "I used to," she said. "Back home. Memphis," he said, because he remembered everything she had said in the store, even when he had been pretending to examine nails. Something moved across her face at the mention of Memphis. Not pain exactly, but the kind of caution that lives in the same neighborhood as pain. "Yes," she said. "You don't have to talk about it," he said. She looked at him with what might have been surprise. "Most people want to know why someone comes to a place like Dust Creek," she said. "Most people are nosy," he said. "It's a failing of small towns." She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polished social kind, but the kind that catches a person off guard and escapes before they can moderate it, and it transformed her face entirely, made her look younger and more unguarded and somehow more herself. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I would." The fiddle player launched into something lively, and Ezekiel Hale, who was not known for dancing, danced. And Julia Dugan, who had not danced since Memphis, danced. And half of Dust Creek stopped what they were doing and watched in the way people watch when they are witnessing something that they know they will be describing later. They danced twice. Then they stood at the edge of the gathering and talked for an hour and a half while the stars came out one by one above the Texas plains. And what they talked about was not the careful, testing conversation of strangers, but the real kind. The kind that runs deeper than politeness, because something has already been established between two people, even if neither of them could name it yet. She told him about her father, who had been a bookkeeper himself and who had taught her the work before he died. She did not tell him what had brought her from Memphis, not yet, but she told him small, true things, and he received them carefully, the way you receive things that matter. He told her about the ranch, about the 200 acres and the cattle and the limestone outcroppings in the north field that made spring plowing interesting. He told her about building the house with Clem and Rodrigo over 3 summers, and how the first winter they had lived in it the roof had leaked in 4 places and they had gotten used to sleeping with pots on the floor. "Is it fixed now?" she asked. "3 of the 4, he said. "Which one isn't?" "The one over the kitchen," he said, "but it only leaks in a very specific kind of rain, so I've learned to move the pot when I see that kind of cloud coming." She smiled at that. "That's a very particular kind of patience," she said. "Ranching teaches it," he said. "Or it takes it from you. Depends on the year." The social wound down around 9 in the evening, and Ezekiel walked Julia and Clara Brent back to the widow's house, because it was the right thing to do and the night was dark, and because he was not ready to stop talking to her, though he did not say the last part. At the door, Julia turned and offered her hand to shake, because she was not a woman who stood on the old-fashioned expectation of what a woman should offer at the end of an evening. He shook it, and their hands held a second longer than a handshake strictly required, and then she went inside, and he walked back to his wagon under the broad Texas sky with the unsettling and entirely pleasant feeling that something in his life had just fundamentally shifted. Clara Brent watched him go from the window. "Oh my," she said quietly, to no one in particular. The secret came out on a Tuesday, which was not a day anyone had expected anything notable to happen. Julia had been in Dust Creek for 6 weeks by then, and in those 6 weeks she had become, if not exactly part of the town's fabric, at least a thread that people were increasingly sure they wanted there. The accounts at Foss General were in the best shape they had been since the store opened. The medicinal herbs she had suggested stocking had proven popular enough that Archibald Foss had given her a quiet, grudging raise and told her she had a good head for business, which, coming from Archibald, was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. She and Ezekiel had seen each other every Thursday, and on 2 occasions he had found reasons to come into town on a Wednesday as well, and on one memorable occasion she had ridden out to his ranch with Clara Brent, ostensibly to see whether there was any ranch supply business she might help organize, which was a reason so thin it was nearly transparent. And Ezekiel had shown them around with the quiet pride of a man showing something he had built to someone whose opinion he had begun to care about very much. The house was a solid 2-story structure of limestone and timber, plain in the way that working houses were plain, nothing decorative, everything functional, but clean and well-made. Julia had looked at it the way she looked at the store's ledgers carefully, thoroughly, seeing what was there. She had noticed the 4th pot problem in the kitchen immediately. "That cloud comes in from the northwest," she said, looking at the ceiling where a dark stain marked the old water's path. "It does," he said. "You could fix it with a redirection shingle," she said, "depending on the pitch." He had looked at her for a moment. "Do you know about roofing?" "My father was a bookkeeper who also fixed things," she said. "I grew up watching." The ease between them was growing into something neither of them had named yet, but on that Tuesday in October the ease was temporarily disrupted. A man arrived on a bay horse, and his name was Douglas Reese, and he was from Memphis, Tennessee, and the moment Julia saw him through the window of the general store, the color left her face entirely. Ezekiel was there, had come in early that week for a specific order he had placed for new fencing wire, and he saw her face change and knew before Douglas Reese even walked through the door that this was something. Douglas Reese was perhaps 35, well-dressed in a way that read as deliberately impressive rather than naturally comfortable, with the kind of handsome face that has learned to use itself as a tool. He walked into Foss General Store with the confidence of a man who was accustomed to finding what he had come looking for. "Julia," he said, "I've been looking for you for 2 months." "Mr. Reese," she said. Her voice was level, but Ezekiel could see her hands had pressed flat against the counter, bracing herself. Archibald Foss, who had excellent instincts for trouble even with failing eyesight, quietly withdrew to the storeroom. Ezekiel did not withdraw. He remained near the fencing wire, not moving, not making a show of it, simply present. "Your father's estate," Douglas Reese said. "There's the matter of the debt." "My father's debt," Julia said carefully, "was between my father and his creditors. My father is dead. The estate was settled." "Not entirely," Reese said. "There's a note that was signed and your name is on it as the co-signatory, which your father added without your full understanding of what it meant. I'm aware of that. I'm not here to be unpleasant, Julia. I'm here because the situation requires resolution." "The situation," she said, "requires a lawyer, and I have already consulted one, and the note was legally unenforceable because I was not of legal age when my father added my name to it." Reese smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "The law in Memphis says differently than the lawyer you found, it seems, but I'm not here to drag you back in a legal argument. I'm here because I wanted to offer you a solution." "What solution?" she asked, and Ezekiel could hear that she already knew the answer and did not want to hear it. "Come back to Memphis," Reese said. "Work in my offices. The debt is forgiven. Simple as that." "It is not simple as that," Julia said, "and you know it." There was a silence, and then Ezekiel Hale set down the fencing wire order he had been holding and walked over. "I think," he said, his voice very quiet and very even, "that the lady has said what she has to say on the matter. Is there something else you need from this store, Mr. Reese? If not, I believe Archibald has other customers." Douglas Reese looked at Ezekiel Hale with the assessment of a man who had learned to calculate odds quickly. He looked at the breadth of those shoulders and the stillness in those dark eyes and made his calculation. "I'll be in town a few days," he said to Julia, "in case you reconsider." "I won't," she said. Reese left. The bell above the door rang his exit. Julia stood for a moment very still, and then something in her posture rearranged itself, as though she were rebuilding a wall that had been briefly shaken. "You do not have to explain," Ezekiel said. "I know," she said, and then she explained anyway, because she had been carrying it alone since Memphis and the weight of it had gotten heavier than she had expected, and because this was Ezekiel Hale, and she had already told him enough true things that one more true thing felt possible. Her father, James Dugan, had been a bookkeeper in Memphis with a good reputation and a bad weakness for speculative investment. He had, in the last 2 years of his life, borrowed money from several sources, including Douglas Reese, who was a businessman of the kind that operated in the gray areas where law and advantage overlapped. When her father died, the debts had come due, and Julia had discovered, in the chaos of settling the estate, that her father had added her name to one particular note without clearly explaining to her what she was signing. She had consulted a lawyer who had told her that the note was legally shaky, but that fighting it would cost her more than she had. She had chosen instead to leave Memphis entirely, to put enough distance between herself and Douglas Reese that the matter would become more trouble than it was worth to pursue. "It appears," she said, with a slight and controlled bitterness that she quickly contained, "that I did not put enough distance." "How much is the debt?" Ezekiel asked. "Ezekiel," she said sharply, because she recognized immediately where that question was going. "I'm asking," he said calmly, "because I'd like to know the shape of the problem, not because I'm going to fix it for you without being asked." She looked at him for a long moment. $340, she said. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," she said, "it's not nothing. But it's also not insurmountable," he said. "It is if you're a woman working at a general store in West Texas," she said, and there was no self-pity in it, only the flat accuracy of facts. "Do you want my help?" He asked, and the directness of it, the simple clean offer without the burden of obligation already draped over it, made her throat tighten. "I don't want to owe anyone else," she said. "I understand that," he said. "It wasn't a condition. It was a question." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, she could see Douglas Reese walking toward the hotel at the far end of the street, his back straight and his step confident in the way of men who believe that waiting is a strategy. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said. Douglas Reese stayed in Dust Creek for 3 days. During those 3 days, he visited Julia twice more at the store, each time with a slightly different angle on the same offer, each time departing without the answer he wanted. On the second visit, Mabel Hutchins happened to be in the store and witnessed the exchange with eyes sharp enough to see in the dark. And by that evening, the general outline of Julia Dugan's situation from Memphis had traveled through Dust Creek with the efficiency of a telegraph wire. The town's reaction was largely and somewhat surprisingly in Julia's favor. "She didn't run from trouble," said Tom Eller, who ran the livery. "She ran from an unfair situation, which is different." "And she came here and worked hard from the first day," said Clara Brent, who had become Julia's most ardent defender with an intensity that surprised even herself. Sheriff Dale Pruitt, who was a careful and fair man with 20 years in the job and very little patience for what he called men who use paper to threaten people, had a quiet word with Douglas Reese on the second morning of his stay, and the word was about the specific nature of his business in Dust Creek and whether it rose to the level of harassment, and while it did not quite rise to that level legally. The sheriff made it clear that Dust Creek was a small town and did not take kindly to outside pressure applied to people who had made their home there. Reese left on the 4th morning early, before most of the town was awake. He left no note and no final word. He simply rode north on the road that led out of the county, and Dust Creek watched him go from behind curtained windows and took a collective breath. Julia heard about his departure from Pete, the stagecoach hand, who had appointed himself an informal scout on the matter and arrived breathless at the store at 7 in the morning to report that the man from Memphis was gone. She stood with this news for a moment, and then she went back to the ledgers with steadier hands than she had had in 4 days. When Ezekiel came in on Thursday, she told him that Reese had left and that she was still considering the question of the debt. "I talked to my lawyer in San Antonio," he said, setting a letter on the counter between them. "By post. The note as you described it has significant legal problems." He wrote it up. She looked at the letter. She looked at him. "You wrote to your lawyer," she said. "I had business with him anyway," he said, which was not entirely a lie but was not the full truth either. "Ezekiel," she said. "Read the letter," he said. "It's information. What you do with it is your own matter." She read the letter. The lawyer in San Antonio, a man named Harwell who had a clear and precise written style, agreed with what her own lawyer had told her and added 2 additional legal points that made the note even more dubious. He offered to correspond directly if she wished to pursue formal resolution. "I'll write to him," she said quietly. "Good," Ezekiel said. She looked up from the letter, and something she had been holding carefully behind her eyes for 6 weeks came very close to the surface. "Thank you," she said, and it was not the polite kind of thanks, it was the kind that comes from somewhere underneath. "You don't have to thank me for writing a letter," he said. "I'm not thanking you for the letter," she said. There was a moment between them then, one of those moments that a careful observer would say nothing visible happened in, but which both of them would remember as the moment the thing between them became undeniable. He cleared his throat. "There's a question I'd like to ask you," he said. "Ask it," she said. "Would you come out to the ranch Sunday?" he said. "Not with Clara Brent this time, just you. I thought I might show you the north field, the limestone outcroppings. In the fall light there's something to see." She looked at him steadily. "Just the limestone outcroppings," she said. "And whatever conversation happens," he said. She smiled. "Yes," she said. "I'll come Sunday." That Sunday, in the deep gold light of an October afternoon in Texas, Ezekiel Hale and Julia Dugan walked the north field of his ranch while the cattle moved slowly in the distance, and the limestone rose in shelves and tilted slabs from the earth, pale and old and somehow beautiful in the way that purely functional things sometimes are when the light catches them right. He had packed a meal in a cloth sack. Simple things: bread from Ernesto Mendez, cured beef, late-season tomatoes from his kitchen garden, a jar of water gone slightly warm in the afternoon heat. They sat on the flattest section of limestone and ate, and the conversation moved easily from the practical to the personal the way conversations do between people who have already done the careful early work. "Do you miss Memphis?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "I miss who I was before Memphis got complicated," she said. "I miss my father. I don't miss the city itself particularly. I was always more comfortable with the work than with the social obligations of it." "You're good with people," he said. "Anyone in Dust Creek will tell you that." "That's different from social obligation," she said. "I like people when they're being real. I find it exhausting when they're performing." He nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. You're not much of a performer," she observed. "No," he agreed. "Never saw the point." She leaned back on her palms and looked up at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary in the west, layering itself in shades of amber and rust and a deep, aching violet at the top. "How did you end up here?" she asked. "In Dust Creek specifically." "I came through on a cattle drive in 1876, he said. "I was 22. I looked at this land and I thought this could be something, so I stayed. Bought the first 40 acres from a man who had given up on it, built on it from there." "Just like that," she said. "Not just like that," he said. It was 6 years of not just like that, but the decision was quick. Some decisions have to be. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you happy here?" He thought about the question, which he appreciated because it was a real question, not a social nicety. "Most days," he said. "Some days it's very lonely." She looked at him at that, and he met her eyes without flinching from what he had just admitted, because he was not a man who said things he did not mean, and the honesty of it sat between them in the warm October air like something newly made. "I have been lonely too," she said, "since my father died. It is a particular kind of lonely when the person who knew you best in the world is suddenly gone." "Yes," he said, "I know that kind." His parents had died within 2 years of each other, he told her. His mother from fever when he was 19, his father from a working accident a year later. He had been alone since then in the fundamental sense, the sense of having no one who remembered you as a child, no one who had watched you become what you were. They sat with that for a while, the shared understanding of it, and it was not sad exactly. It was the kind of sorrow that has been lived with long enough that it has become part of the landscape rather than a fresh wound. The sun finished its descent. The stars were appearing. He walked her back to where her horse was tied, the livery horse she had rented for the afternoon, and at the point where she would mount and ride back to Dusk Creek, she turned to him and said with the directness that he had come to love about her, "Ezekiel, what is it that you want from this, from spending time with me?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he was making sure he said it right. "I want to know you," he said. "All of it. The part that came from Memphis and the part that's been here and the part that comes next. I want to know if what I think I feel is what I actually feel, and the only way to find that out is to have more days like today." She looked at him. "That is a very careful answer," she said. "I'm a careful man," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I like it." And then she mounted and rode back toward Dusk Creek with the stars coming fully out above her. And Ezekiel Hale stood at the edge of his north field and watched her go, and felt something in him that was not loneliness for the first time in a long time. November came to the Texas plains with a cold that announced itself without apology, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in 2 days, and turning the last of the grass silver with frost in the mornings. The cattle needed moving to the lower pasture. The fencing needed a final check before winter, and Ezekiel was busy from before dawn to after dark most days. But every Thursday he came into town, and now more often than not he found reasons for Wednesday as well. The town of Dusk Creek had been watching this progression with the attentiveness of people who have limited entertainment and no scruples about openly discussing other people's romantic prospects. Mabel Hutchins said to Clara Brent that she had never seen Ezekiel Hale look at anything the way he looked at that girl, and she had known Ezekiel Hale for 6 years. Clara Brent said that she had never seen Julia Dugan look forward to anything the way she looked forward to Thursdays, and that she had a very good idea why. Tom Eller at the livery noticed that Ezekiel's horse was being watered at the trough more often than strictly necessary for a man who had supplies to collect, and he mentioned this observation to Clem, who had worked for Ezekiel for 4 years, and who simply said, "About time," with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for something to resolve itself. What the town was watching was real. What Ezekiel and Julia had been building in their Thursday conversations, and the Sunday afternoon at the North Field, and the Wednesday visits that started as practical and became something else, was a foundation. And foundations in the Wild West were built carefully, because the ground was often less stable than it appeared. There were still things she had not told him. There were still things he did not know how to say. But they were in the particular kind of proximity where unsaid things do not stay unsaid indefinitely. It was the second Sunday of November when she told him everything. They were in the kitchen of his house because the weather had closed in too much for the North Field, and she had arrived in a coat and gloves while the sky threatened the first real norther of the season. He had made coffee, strong and black the way he always made it, and she had warmed her hands on the cup and looked out the window at the pale, leaden sky. Douglas Reese, she said without preamble, was not just a creditor. He waited. He was a man who had decided, about a year before my father died, that he wanted to marry me, she said. He made that very clear. He was polite about it for a while, and then he was less polite about it. My father, to his credit, did not encourage him. But my father was also in financial difficulty, and Reese was a man with money and resources, and there are only so many ways a situation like that can go. He used the debt as leverage, Ezekiel said. He intended to, she said. But my father died before Reese could fully execute on that. And when the estate was being settled and I found my name on that note, I understood what it meant. Reese had planned for a contingency. He put your name on the note so that the debt would follow you even after your father was gone, Ezekiel said, his voice very level. Yes, she said. Come back to Memphis. Work in my offices was not actually about working in his offices. No, Ezekiel said. It wouldn't have been. I left, she said. I know some people would say I should have stayed and fought it, but I was alone and the law is not simple for women in these situations, and I chose to use the resources I had, which were my own 2 feet and my father's knowledge in my head. You made the right choice, he said. She looked at him. You don't have to say that. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm saying it because it's true. You assessed your situation and you made the best decision you could with what you had. That's not running away. That's being practical. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something she had not said to anyone since coming to Dust Creek. I was afraid, she said. Not just of the debt and the legal situation, I was afraid of him. The quality of the silence in the kitchen changed. He never hurt me, she said quickly. Not physically, but there was something in the way he wanted, the way he pursued things he had decided he wanted, that frightened me. I believe you, Ezekiel said, and 3 simple words had never carried so much weight. She looked at her coffee cup. I have not told anyone else the full shape of it, she said. I won't repeat it, he said. I know, she said. That is why I told you. They sat in the kitchen, while the norther came in outside and rattled the window glass, and made the wood stove tick with the difference in pressure. And they talked for 2 more hours about everything and nothing. And somewhere in the middle of it, Julia Dugan discovered that the thing she had been keeping most carefully protected inside herself, the part that had been shut down since Memphis and the debt and the fear and the loss of her father, had opened like a window someone had finally gotten around to unlocking. She left before dark, riding back to town with the cold wind behind her and the whole Texas sky pressing low and gray overhead, and she was smiling into the cold for reasons she did not entirely understand, but was no longer afraid to feel. On the Tuesday before Christmas, Ezekiel Hale rode into Dust Creek on a cold, bright morning when the mud was frozen in the street, and every exhaled breath made a small cloud, and he went directly to Foss General Store and was relieved to find it empty of customers at that early hour. Julia was at her desk behind the counter, writing in the ledger, and she looked up when the bell rang and said his name with the particular warmth she had started using for it, a warmth that held the whole November in it. I have something to ask you, he said, and he was direct about it because he was a direct man, and because he had spent 3 weeks being less direct and it had not suited him. She set down her pen. Ask it, she said, because she always said ask it. I want to court you properly, he said. I have been going around it for 3 months, and I am tired of going around things. I would like to call on you, and I would like Clara Brent to know that is what I am doing, and I would like you to know that my intentions are serious. Julia looked at him with those direct eyes for a long moment. How serious? She asked. Entirely serious, he said. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, I have been waiting for you to stop going around things. He smiled, and it was the smile she had been waiting to see more of since the day she arrived, the one that changed the whole structure of his face, that made him look younger and warmer and more human than his usual careful expression suggested. Is that a yes? He said. Yes, Ezekiel, she said. That is a yes. He called on her that evening at Clara Brent's house, formally, with his hat in his hand, and Clara Brent opened the door and looked at him and said, Well, it is about time, with a satisfaction that was entirely undisguised, and Ezekiel thought that apparently everyone in Dust Creek had been waiting for him to stop going around things. The courtship that December and into January was the kind that Dust Creek had not seen before and would not see again, not because it was showy or dramatic, but because of the quality of attention they paid to each other, the way they listened with their full selves, the way they argued, when they argued, with the careful honesty of people who respected each other enough to disagree without cruelty. They disagreed about practical things mostly. She thought the ranch kitchen needed a better ventilation arrangement above the stove. He thought the current arrangement was adequate. She drew him a diagram on a piece of paper. He looked at the diagram, thought about it for 3 days, and came back and said she was right, and could she explain the specific modification she had in mind, which she did. And by the middle of January, the kitchen was better ventilated, and the 4th pot leak in the roof had been fixed with a redirected shingle following her original suggestion, which had required only 2 hours of work on a dry afternoon. He taught her to ride properly, not just the practical borrowed horse way she had been doing, but confidently, with an understanding of how the animal moved. She was a quick student and he was a patient teacher, and the lessons became some of their best hours, out in the cold winter air with the horses breathing steam and the plains around them stretching quiet and enormous under the winter sky. She wrote to the lawyer Harwell in San Antonio, using the information Ezekiel had passed along, and Harwell wrote back with a detailed letter outlining exactly how the note could be formally challenged and what that process would look like. The cost of the formal challenge was less than Julia had expected, because she had originally been quoted figures by a Memphis lawyer who had perhaps not been working entirely in her interest. Ezekiel did not offer to pay the legal costs. He had learned the lines of her pride and he respected them absolutely. What he did do was help her review the letter from Harwell and write her responses, sitting across from her at Clara Brent's kitchen table on a Thursday evening while Clara pretended to be very busy with her sewing in the next room, and was in fact listening to every word. "You have a gift for legal language," Ezekiel observed, watching her write. "I read everything my father worked on," she said. "You absorb what you grow up around." "What was he like?" Ezekiel asked. "Your father, when things were good?" She smiled at the ledger as she wrote. "Funny," she said. "He was very quietly funny. He would say something and you would not realize it was a joke until 3 seconds later, and then he would be looking at something else, very innocent, as though he had not said anything." "I would have liked him," Ezekiel said. She looked up from her writing and something in her face was very gentle and very certain. "Yes," she said, "you would have." It was in February that things between them moved past the careful and into the certain. They had gone for a long ride on a Sunday, east of the ranch toward a place Ezekiel knew, where a spring came up through the rock and made a small pool even in winter, and the cottonwood trees around it were bare but beautiful, their white limbs against a sky that was doing something complex and gray-pink with winter clouds. They sat on a flat rock near the spring and the horses grazed behind them, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that only exists between people who have stopped performing for each other. "I love you," Ezekiel Hale said. He said it the way he said most important things, without decoration, directly into the space between them, looking at her without any attempt to manage her reaction. Julia Dugan turned to look at him. The winter light caught her face and made something of it, and she looked at this man who had written to his lawyer for her, and fixed the roof shingle and taught her to ride and sat across from her at tables full of ledgers and papers, and never once made her feel as though she owed him anything for any of it. And she said, "I love you too. I have loved you since November, probably, but November had too much else in it to say so." He reached out and took her hand, her wool-gloved hand in his leather-gloved one, and they sat by the winter spring in the enormous quiet of the Texas plains, and were, for the first time in both their lives, entirely not alone. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in late March when the first real warmth of spring was coming back to the ground, and the grass was green again and everything looked new. He had thought about elaborate approaches and dismissed them one by one because they were not him, and he was trying always to be himself with her, which was the most important thing he had figured out in the past 6 months. He asked her in the kitchen of the ranch house, after they had spent the morning working on the spring planting plan, with her still holding the pencil she had been using to mark the kitchen garden layout, and him across the table with his coffee gone cold and the spring sunlight coming through the window. "Julia Dugan," he said, "will you marry me?" She put the pencil down. She looked at him with the full weight of those eyes that had been looking at him seriously and clearly since the very first day. "Yes," she said. "Ezekiel Hale, I will marry you." He had a ring. He had ordered it from a jeweler in San Antonio in February, a gold band with a small garnet set into it, because he had noticed her noticing the garnets in a brooch that Clara Brent wore, and the noticing of that noticing was the kind of attention that could not be faked. He took it from his vest pocket and slid it onto her finger, and she looked at it and then at him, and her eyes were bright. "It fits," she said. "I asked Clara Brent to borrow a ring of yours to size it," he admitted. She laughed the real laugh, the one that escaped before she could moderate it. "Clara Brent knew before I did," she said. "Clara Brent has known since August," he said. "She told me so." Dust Creek learned about the engagement inside of 48 hours, which was faster than the telegraph and roughly as accurate. The response was overwhelmingly celebratory, with the exception of Archibald Foss, who was happy for them as people but concerned about his accounts, and who took Julia aside and asked very seriously whether she would be willing to continue working after the marriage. And she said yes, at least until they had figured out the shape of things on the ranch. And Archibald said that was satisfactory and shook her hand with more warmth than he had shown anyone in years. The wedding happened in June, the Saturday of the third week, because Julia had said she wanted the summer roses from Clara Brent's garden to be properly bloomed, and they were. Clara grew them along the fence of her yard, old roses in pink and white, and on the Friday evening before the wedding the three of them, Clara and Julia and Mabel Hutchins, who had been recruited, cut the blooms and arranged them in every jar and tin they could find in the church. The church was small and had been built for a congregation of 50 and was straining to hold the 70 who came. The sheriff was there, and Tom Eller and his wife, and Clem and Rodrigo, who had dressed in the good shirts they reserved for occasions of genuine significance. Ernesto Mendez and his family came the 6 miles from the creek road, and old Ernesto had brought bread because he could not attend anything without bringing bread, and the bread was excellent. Pete, the stagecoach hand, had grown 2 inches since August and stood in the back with the gravity of someone attending a historical event. Julia walked down the narrow aisle of the leaning church in a dress she had made herself over the preceding 2 months, ivory cotton with small pearl buttons at the wrists, simple and right, the way she was. Clara Brent walked with her because there was no father to walk with her, and Clara had been the closest thing to family this western land had offered. At the end of the aisle, Ezekiel Hale stood with his hat held in front of him, wearing his good dark jacket and a shirt that was white, and had been ironed by his own hand that morning with more care than he usually applied to shirts. When he saw her, something in his expression moved, shifted, opened in a way that only a handful of people in Dust Creek were ever lucky enough to witness. That particular unguarded look that appeared only when Julia Dugan walked into a room. The pastor, Reverend Albrook, who had been officiating Dust Creek weddings for 11 years, said later that he had done over 60 such services, and he had never felt so absolutely certain that 2 people meant every word they were saying as he did that Saturday. They said the words. They meant the words. Ezekiel slid a plain gold wedding band onto her finger next to the garnet ring, and she slid a plain gold band onto his. And when Reverend Albrook said what God has joined together, the church was very quiet with the weight of the moment. And then it was not quiet at all because Mabel Hutchins started crying first, and that started a chain reaction that included Clara Brent and at least 4 other women, and reportedly, Tom Eller. Though he would deny this afterward with considerable conviction. The reception was held on the green space behind the church, the same place as the summer social where they had first danced, and the fiddle player, who had the memory of an elephant for social significance, played the same lively tune he had played 10 months ago, and Ezekiel Hale and Julia Hale danced. And this time the whole town watched them without pretending to do anything else, because there was no longer any reason to pretend. The matter of Douglas Reese and the debt from Memphis had been formally resolved in April, 3 weeks before the engagement, through the legal process that Harwell in San Antonio had outlined. The note had been declared unenforceable by a Texas court, which had jurisdiction over Julia as a Texas resident, and Harwell had sent notification to Reese's lawyer in Memphis with the court's determination. Reese had not responded and had not appeared in Dust Creek again. Whether he had accepted the legal outcome or simply decided that the pursuit was no longer worth his effort was unclear, but the matter was closed, and Julia had paid Harwell's fee herself from her wages at the store, which she had mentioned to Ezekiel with a satisfaction so complete that he had not been able to stop smiling about it for the rest of the day. Life on the Hale Ranch, as it was known from that summer forward, organized itself around two people who were genuinely suited to each other, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than any of the things people usually spend their time pursuing. Julia kept the accounts at Foss General Store through the summer and autumn of their first year, riding in 3 days a week on the good bay mare that Ezekiel had bought her in May, a horse she named Arithmetic, which made Archibald Foss say that was an odd name for a horse, and Julia say that it suited her character, and the horse being both reliable and occasionally frustrating in equal measure seemed to bear this out. The ranch itself benefited from Julia's presence in ways that extended beyond the obvious domestic improvements, though those were considerable. She had a practical intelligence that approached problems from angles Ezekiel had not considered, and over their first year together, they had 3 disagreements about ranch strategy, all of which were resolved by some combination of both their positions. And in each case, the combined approach turned out to be better than either individual one. Clem, who had worked for Ezekiel for 4 years and considered himself something of a judge of character, told Rodrigo in November of their first year that Mrs. Hale was the best thing that had happened to this ranch and to Ezekiel specifically, and that he was glad the man had finally stopped going around things. And Rodrigo, who had held this opinion since August and the summer social when he had seen them dance, agreed completely. The first winter of their marriage was the good kind of hard, the kind where the difficulties are external, weather and work, and the challenges of a working ranch in cold months, rather than internal, because inside the limestone house with its fixed roof and improved kitchen ventilation, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove. They read to each other in the evenings, by lamplight, from the small collection of books they had assembled between them. Julia had brought 3 from Memphis, and Ezekiel had 2 that had come west with him from his family's home in Missouri, and over the course of the year, they added to the collection when a book came through the store that interested either of them. They argued about which books were worth their time with the same direct engagement they applied to everything, and the arguments were as enjoyable as the reading. In February of 1884, Julia discovered she was expecting a child. She told Ezekiel on a Sunday morning before the sun was fully up, while they were in the kitchen and he was making coffee, and she was standing at the window watching the first light change the color of the frost on the grass. She said it plainly, as she said everything, and he set down the coffee pot and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her with the kind of care that is also a kind of gratitude, and they stood there in the early light without saying anything for a long time. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly, "a little. Are you?" "Yes," he said, "a little, and then, but mostly I am not frightened at all." She laughed against his shoulder. "That contradiction makes no sense." "It makes complete sense," he said. "The little frightened part is just being careful. The rest is just knowing that this is what I want." Their son was born in October of 1884 in the room above the kitchen, attended by the town doctor, a steady-handed man named Dr. Farrell who had been practicing in Dust Creek for 8 years. Clara Brent was there, because Clara Brent was always where she was needed. Ezekiel was there, which was not universally the custom, but was his absolute intention regardless of custom. The baby was born in the early morning, when the sky was still that particular gray-black before dawn, and he came into the world with the decisive energy of someone who had places to be. And when Dr. Farrell placed him in Julia's arms, she looked at this small, red, furiously alive person, and felt something so enormous that she had no word for it yet. Ezekiel stood at her side with his hand on her shoulder, looking at his son, and the expression on his face was one that Dust Creek would never see because it was private to that room and that morning, but it was the kind of expression that changes a person permanently. They named him James Hale after her father, which had been Ezekiel's suggestion. She had looked at him when he suggested it in the weeks before the birth when they were discussing names, and she had not been able to speak for a moment. "Your father gave you everything that matters," Ezekiel had said simply. "It seems right." James Hale came into the town of Dust Creek for the first time at 3 weeks old, bundled against the October air, when Julia brought him to Foss General Store to show Archibald Foss, who looked at the baby with the expression of a man who had forgotten. He was capable of that particular kind of feeling, and was startled to discover he still was. Pete, who was now 17 and had been working at the livery part-time, came out to look at the baby with the solemnity of someone attending something important. Clara Brent cried, which was by this point expected. Mabel Hutchins had already knitted 3 blankets in anticipation. Clem and Rodrigo rode in from the ranch on a Wednesday specifically to see the baby, which they both claimed was coincidental to other business in town, and nobody believed them, and they did not actually seem to be trying very hard to be believed. The town of Dust Creek, which had watched Julia Dugan arrive as a stranger 13 months ago with a leather trunk and a carpetbag, watched her now with her child in her arms and her husband at her side, and understood what it meant for a place to have been changed by a person. In the spring of 1885, a letter came from the San Antonio lawyer Harwell informing Julia that Douglas Reese had filed a final attempt to recover the debt through a federal court in Tennessee, and that this attempt had been dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be brought again. The matter was permanently and irrevocably closed. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked out the window at the ranch, at the green spring grass, and the cattle moving slowly in the lower pasture, and Clem repairing the north fence and James's small collection of toys on the porch. And she felt the last held tension in a place she had not fully known was still holding finally release. She wrote a letter back to Harwell thanking him and settled his final invoice with a promptness that he had come to associate with her over the 2 years of their professional correspondence. That evening she told Ezekiel, and he listened, and then he said, "Is it finished?" "Yes," she said, "completely." He nodded slowly with the satisfaction of a man watching a long and difficult fence repair finally come good. "Good," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. "You have never once made me feel as though the trouble I came with was a burden to you," she said. "It wasn't," he said. "It was just part of you. You don't get a person without their history." "Most people try to," she said. "I wasn't interested in most of you," he said. "I was interested in all of you." She looked at this man who had said that, who had meant it from the beginning even before he had said it, and the feeling she had for him was so full and particular that she thought sometimes it was a wonder a person could hold that much of something and still go about ordinary life, still make coffee and tend the kitchen garden and ride arithmetic to the store 3 days a week. But ordinary life was also made of this, she had discovered. Love did not live outside of ordinary days. It lived inside them, in the coffee being made and the ledgers being kept, and the night wind rattling the windows that were now properly sealed, and the sound of a child sleeping in the room above. James Hale grew up on 200 acres of Texas limestone and good grass, with a father who taught him that land required patience and honesty and attention, and a mother who taught him that numbers told stories if you read them carefully, and that a woman could be as strong and clear-eyed as any man, and that coming to a new place was not a defeat, but sometimes the truest kind of courage. By the time James was 2, Julia had largely transitioned her work with Foss General Store to a consulting arrangement, coming in 2 days a week to review the accounts and less for the daily operation, which freed her time for the ranch's own accounts, which had grown complex enough to warrant serious attention as Ezekiel had expanded his herd and added another 40 acres on the north boundary. In the spring of 1886, Julia was expecting their second child. This pregnancy was different from the first, not harder necessarily but more companionable, because this time she knew the shape of it, and James was there underfoot, 2 years old and extremely opinionated about everything, and the household had a different energy, fuller, more complex, more noisy. Ezekiel had taken on a third hired hand by then, a young man of 21 named Samuel, who was quiet and steady, and who had an instinct for cattle that Ezekiel recognized as rare and worth developing. With Clem and Rodrigo and Samuel, the ranch operated with a rhythm that felt well established, earned through years of work. The second child arrived in November of 1886, a girl this time, and they named her Clara, after the widow who had given Julia her first room in Dust Creek, and who had become as close to family as this Western life had to offer. When they told Clara Brent what they had named the baby, the older woman sat in the chair in Julia's room above the kitchen where she had come to meet the new arrival, and she held baby Clara in her arms, and she wept in the open, unself-conscious way of someone who has received more than they knew they were hoping for. "I am going to tell you things your mother should not hear," Clara Brent whispered to the baby with complete seriousness, and Julia said from the bed, "I can hear everything you say, Clara," and Clara said, "I know," without any alteration to her tone. Dust Creek at this point had grown slightly, not much, from 300 souls to perhaps 360, and it still had the Copper Spur Saloon and the Leaning Church and Foss General Store and the livery and the sheriff's office, whose window had finally been properly repaired in 1884, when Sheriff Pruitt had gotten so tired of looking at the oilcloth that he had replaced it himself. What it also had now was a story, the story of the woman who had arrived on the Thursday stagecoach in August of 1882 with a leather trunk and a complicated history, and had stayed to build something. The woman who had fixed Archibald Foss's accounts and danced at the summer social and ridden in the north field with the limestone rising around her, and married the most careful man in the county in the Leaning Church with Clara Brent's roses everywhere, and named her children James and Clara, and made a life on 200 acres of Texas limestone that was entirely and authentically her own. It was the kind of story that a small town holds on to because it is a reminder of what a place can be when it makes room for something new, when it chooses welcome over suspicion, when it decides that a stranger with a complicated past is worth knowing. By 1887, with 2 children in the house and the ranch producing well and Julia's own professional reputation as a keeper of accounts having spread quietly through the county so that 2 other businesses, the Copper Spur and a new hardware concern that had set up in Dust Creek's growing south end, had engaged her services, the life they had built was recognizable as something complete, not finished. Complete is different from finished. Finished means over. Complete means whole. Ezekiel still came in from the fields at dusk with the same particular quietness she had come to read as well as any language, knowing when the day had been hard, and when it had gone well, and when he had been thinking something through and needed the kitchen and the lamp and coffee to work it to its conclusion. She still brought arithmetic in from the pasture 3 mornings a week and rode to town with the account books in the saddlebag. James had learned to walk and then to run and now spent his days following Clem around the ranch with the intensity of a 3-year-old who has decided that this is the most interesting man in the world, which Clem found embarrassing and was secretly delighted by. Baby Clara had her mother's eyes, that direct dark gaze that took everything in and gave away only what it chose to. And Ezekiel would sometimes catch himself looking at his daughter and thinking that Dust Creek was going to have to be ready for this one in about 20 years. And he felt, with the whole easy certainty of a man who has built what he wanted from good materials, grateful for every ordinary day. In the autumn of 1887, 5 years after the stagecoach pulled into Dust Creek with a woman and a leather trunk and a secret, Ezekiel Hale and Julia Hale sat on the porch of the limestone house in the long October evening, while James chased something in the yard with the single-minded focus of small boys, and Clara slept in the room above the kitchen, and the stars were coming out one by one over the Texas plains in the dark blue vault of the early night. "Are you happy?" He asked because he asked her still, because he believed in asking rather than assuming. She looked at the stars for a moment and then at him with all that directness that had not lessened in 5 years but had deepened, become something more particular and more rooted. "Yes," she said, completely and specifically. "Good," he said. "Are you?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "every single ordinary day." She leaned against him, her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her in the way that had become as natural as breathing. And they watched the last light leave the western sky and the stars take over. And James eventually ran out of whatever he had been chasing and came and climbed onto the porch and leaned against his father's leg and looked up at the sky with the same serious attention that was entirely his mother's. And Ezekiel's free hand came to rest on the boy's head. The town of Dust Creek, Texas, in the years that followed, grew and changed in the way that all small western towns grew and changed in the late years of the 19th century. Some things better, some things lost, the railroad coming eventually closer, new families arriving, old ones moving on. The injustices of that era were woven into the land and the law in ways that were not quickly or easily undone. The exclusions and inequalities that made the West hard for people who were not white and male and propertied, the legal structures that had given Douglas Reese his original leverage over a woman and her dead father's debts, the systems that made a woman's choices narrower than a man's in ways that cost real people real things. These were not abstract problems. They were the water that the story swam in, and the story knew it. But within that water, in the particular space of a limestone ranch on 200 acres east of Dust Creek, something had been built that was real and lasting and made of the best materials human beings have available to them: honesty and patience and the willingness to know another person all the way down and choose them anyway. Julia Dugan had arrived as a stranger on a Thursday in August. She had left, on the arm of a cowboy who was also her husband, on a Saturday in June when the roses were blooming in Clara Brent's yard, and the town of Dust Creek, Texas, had never quite recovered from the story, which was exactly how she would have wanted it. James Hale grew into a young man of his father's steadiness and his mother's sharpness, and he worked the ranch as he grew into his height and his sense of himself, and by the time he was 16, he was keeping a portion of the accounts alongside his mother, because she had begun teaching him at 12, and he had his grandfather's gift for it, that quiet facility with numbers that James Dugan Sr. had passed down through his daughter into his grandson without ever knowing he had done it. Clara Hale grew into a girl of opinions and precision, who could be found reading at the age of 7 with the focused intensity of someone studying for an examination, who argued points at the dinner table with the clear-eyed logic of someone who had been raised in a house where honest disagreement was the norm, and who had a laugh that was exactly her mother's, the real one that escaped before it could be moderated, and that could be heard from 3 rooms away. Archibald Foss retired in 1889 and sold the store to a younger man who kept Julia on as his account keeper, which she had not entirely expected, but was not surprised by because she had made herself indispensable through 7 years of careful work. and she was in any case not the kind of woman who needed things to go her way to know her own value. Clara Brent, the widow, remained in her house on the edge of town with her roses and her opinions about gentlemen callers, which she had not yet had occasion to revise, and she was godmother to both James and Clara, and held this position with all the seriousness it deserved, appearing at every birthday and Christmas and significant occasion with presents and opinions in roughly equal measure. Clem retired from active ranch work in 1890 because his knees had finally registered their long-standing complaint about 20 years of outdoor labor, and he moved into a small room in Tom Eller's house in town, where he was treated with the particular honor that Dust Creek extended to people who had been there long enough to become part of its own story. He came out to the ranch on Sundays because Rodrigo was still there, and because James had been his unofficial student for 8 years, and because Sunday dinner at the Hale Ranch was, by general agreement, one of the best meals in the county. Rodrigo worked the ranch until 1893, when his brother in New Mexico asked him to come help with a land situation that required a man who knew cattle and wasn't afraid of hard work. And Rodrigo went with the blessing of both Ezekiel and Julia, and a tearful farewell from Clara Hale, who was 8 years old, and had decided that Rodrigo was the funniest person in the world, and was not happy about this departure. He wrote to them in his careful, slightly formal hand, twice a year for the rest of the decade, and they wrote back. Samuel, the young hand Ezekiel had taken on in 1885, stayed. He grew into his 20s and then his 30s on the Hale Ranch, becoming as essential to its operation as the land itself. And in 1892, he married a young woman named Rosa who had come to Dust Creek with her family from Sonora, Mexico, and they built a small house on the west edge of the ranch property. And the Hale Ranch became, over time, a place that was home to more than just one family, which was exactly the kind of thing that happened when the foundation was built right. In the evenings, in the seasons of their life together, Ezekiel Hale and Julia Hale would find each other, the way people do who have been together long enough that finding each other is less a choice than a gravity, drawn together at the end of the day with the ease of long practice. They would sit on the porch in the warm months and by the stove in the cold ones, with the sounds of the ranch settling into night around them, with children asleep in rooms above, with the whole enormous Texas sky pressing down gentle and brilliant outside the windows. And sometimes one of them would say something, a thought or an observation or a question, and the other would answer. And the conversation would be the kind that only exists between people who have built something together over years and know its every feature, its strengths and its fixed imperfections and the places where it surprised them still, which were more numerous than either of them would have expected. I used to think, Julia said one evening in the spring of 1892, with James 9 years old and reading in the next room and Clara 6 and already asleep and the window open to the Texas night, that coming here was a retreat, leaving something. And now, Ezekiel said. Now I think it was the most purposeful thing I ever did, she said. I just did not know it was purposeful at the time. I thought I was running away. You were moving toward, he said. She looked at him. Toward what? This, he said, with a simplicity that was characteristic of him, meaning everything in the room and beyond it, the ranch and the children and the 10 years of Thursday conversations and Sunday afternoons and ordinary evenings that had accumulated into a life. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, yes, toward this. They remained on the porch until the night was fully dark and the stars had completed their arrangement across the sky, and the warm wind came in from the south with the smell of the spring grass, and somewhere in the north field the cattle moved in the dark, and the limestone stood where it had always stood, pale and permanent and patient, and the house held everything that mattered behind its solid walls, and Ezekiel Hale and Julia Hale sat in the particular piece of people who have found, against the long odds that life tends to present, exactly the right place in the world and the right person to stand in it with. The town of Dust Creek would go on talking about it. That was the nature of the story, and the nature of small towns. Years after, when people who had been children during those first months remembered what they had seen, they described it the way you describe something that has become part of how you understand love to work, not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, inevitable brightening, like the Texas dawn that came every morning over the limestone plains and turned the world gold from the east while everything still looked gray and ordinary, until suddenly it didn't. Until suddenly there was light everywhere, and it was impossible to remember that there had been anything else. That was how it had been. That was how it stayed. She had arrived as a stranger on a Thursday in August. She had left, the cowboy's wife, on a Saturday in June. And the town of Dust Creek, Texas, never quite recovered from the story of how it happened, told it at socials and over fences, and in the back room of Foss General Store for as long as anyone who had been there could remember it, which was a long time, because in a place as quiet as the Texas plains in 1882, love at its most genuine and most true was the kind of thing that rang like a bell in clear air, and the sound of it carried. It carried.